Thank you. Mr. Rivera is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad our friends on the other side mentioned Cuba just now, because I don't think they were accurate in their assessment. The money that goes for Cuban democracy programs does not go to the Cuban government. The money that goes to the democracy programs goes to civil society members.
Will the gentleman
members that are, I will in a moment, members that are dissidents, human rights activists, people that are struggling against the Cuban dictatorship, people like the Mothers in White that march and are repressed by the Cuban government, human rights dissidents like Orlando Zapata Tamayo, who was murdered while on a hunger strike protesting human rights in Cuba. I don't think Orlando Zapata Tamayo was a member of the United Nations or was voting against us more than 50% of the time at the United Nations. But it's very interesting to me how much criticism is leveled against the waiver provision that Congressman Duncan has enshrined in this amendment. I can recall about 15 years ago when 4 Americans were murdered in international airspace by the Castro dictatorship, and Congressman Burton at that time authored legislation to sanction the Castro dictatorship for murdering those 4 Americans, and it was insisted upon the sponsors of that legislation at that time, Jesse Helms and Dan Burton, to have a waiver provision for President Clinton to be able to waive the sanctions against the Castro dictatorship after they had just murdered 4 Americans in a civilian aircraft in international airspace.
With the gentleman.
So if I will yield in a moment. So if 4 Americans, if their lives were not worthy of having specific concrete sanctions and a waiver was demanded at that point, I would think here we're talking about votes. I think 4 American lives are more important than votes at the United Nations. But Congressman Duncan is still providing that waiver because, you know, we might have some folks that are more allied with us than others, and they may vote 49.9%. And we don't want to be unreasonable, certainly, and Congressman Duncan has provided for a way for the administration to provide that waiver. But again, we're being very selective in our criticism because if it wasn't good enough when 4 Americans were murdered to have sanctions leveled, then I would think that certainly for voting decisions at the United Nations, we can have a waiver provision. And before I yield to the side, I want to yield to Congressman Rohrabacher.